Hi, welcome to Spooky Hours. My name is David Saunderson, and today we're joined by Kate Cherrell, writer and researcher from burialsandbeyond.com. How are you, Kate?
I'm good, thank you.
You're still coping all right because we haven't seen you for a few weeks. We did a video with you maybe at the start of all this pandemic, and we're still surviving. We asked you back to talk about your favourite cemeteries. Obviously, being a blogger who has a website called burialsandbeyond.com, you probably have a few favourite cemeteries around England. So can you maybe give us what they are, so once all this pandemic and all the lockdown is finally over, we could start getting about and seeing some great cemeteries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, I for one am certainly missing travelling a bit further afield to see cemeteries. So, maybe my top 5 might give some of the viewers a little bit of get up and go for when we can actually leave the house.
Oh, so you've picked some that I've never heard of, and that's always a good thing, because I think when we always do these things, we tend to do like the really big metropolitan cemeteries like Highgate, and indeed I went to Brompton Cemetery just the other day, and these are places where they have lots of famous people in and lots of people go to them. The first one you've picked is Cleethorpes in Lincolnshire, which I believe is your childhood cemetery.
Yes, yeah, I know it doesn't sound particularly normal to have a childhood cemetery, but yeah, I wanted to speak about Cleethorpes because growing up, my granddad used to take me round the cemetery twice a week in my pushchair, every Tuesday and Thursday. And when you are so used to, to a route or to a certain location, you don't really think that could be anything a bit odd about being so comfortable in a cemetery, especially at a young age. But I think Cleethorpes is a good example of a relatively, it's an unremarkable cemetery. It's only about 30 acres, and it's got a chapel. It's all on one level. It's very Lincolnshire. It's very flat. But I think that having such a positive and relaxed relationship with a local cemetery in a place where a lot of my family are buried is it's a really positive and very death positive thing to have in your life. So I think perhaps after lockdown, if anyone thinks that they don't have a great relationship with cemeteries and visiting, graves of loved ones, they should try and develop more of a positive relationship with a burial site. And for me, that's what Cleethorpes Cemetery it is. And I do have a very positive outlook on it. It's not especially pretty. I'm not selling it, I know, but I'm allowed to say this, I'm local. But a lot of the headstones reflect real social history. I think in a lot of local burial sites, we can skim past them because we're so used to seeing the same headstones, the same rows of people. But reading more of the inscriptions, you can see a lot of very personal stories, especially relating to local culture and industry. And with Cleethorpes in Grimsby having quite a big fishing industry, a lot to do with lifeboats. When you start passing these particularly normal looking headstones and you look a bit deeper, you can feel a lot more interlinked to your hometown. And I think that's something that is very precious. And I think a lot of us are very lucky to have that. So Cleethorpes for me is more of like a link to the past and a very positive grounding for my own identity. And I think other people should have a bash at that too.
So you're saying that, in your own hometown, in other people's hometown, they should go and check out their cemetery. It doesn't need to be a big exotic one in the middle of a city. It could be just their Cleethorpes, and find about their own past, really, and
Exactly.
how their city was developed. So,
Yeah.
so the next one you mentioned is Nottingham Rock Cemetery.
Mm.
Tell us why have you picked that as one of your favourite cemeteries?
Well, all of these I've picked, I've made. They're more hidden gems. I'm certainly not one to knock the Magnificent Seven and the enormous London cemeteries, but places like Rock Cemetery, it's completely hidden away. It's just off Mansfield Road in Nottingham by Park and Ride. If anyone wants to visit, you can walk from there. And it's an absolutely stunning Victorian cemetery. It's very, very packed tightly with interments, and it has an enormous concealed set of catacombs. It's, Rock Cemetery itself is on all levels, so it's a very jumbled cemetery with some enormous beautiful monuments to a lot of local brewers. That's an interesting word. And people are standing. So there's phenomenal big Victorian monoliths, which again we see in lots of other city cemeteries. But there's a whole walkway that's just stacked deep with angels. I mean, you know, we're talking 8, 9 feet tall, 10 feet tall, and each of them are different. I think that's really interesting, that you can see something and think that it's so homogenized, but then there'll be an angel carrying 2 babies, or there'll be an angel that looks like someone's wife. And once you go past that alleyway, you can get into the catacombs and the caves in Rock Cemetery. And Rock Cemetery was originally, it was a sand pit, because the sandstone in that area was used in the glass making industry. And in Nottingham in particular, this sand that was used for glass was very useful, because Nottingham had such an enormous amount of pubs that got through an enormous amount of glasses. So I quite like the link that, you know, we've got death and drinking together, which I think is, you know, always lovely. But in the caves underneath, some of them are natural formations, some of them are as an offshoot of mining. It links into the local legend of Robin Hood. And local legend states that these caves underneath were where Robin Hood, you know, hid his horses overnight to escape the sheriff, and which I think is wonderful. And underneath, with the more man-made caves, there's a lot of very dodgy and hilarious graffiti, and it's all very jovial and very funny. But Rock City's catacombs are so striking in that you can only access them by private tour now. But the whole place was made safe and hollowed out by enormous amounts of poor workers and very, very young labourers. And so while you get into this beautiful catacomb, and it's an enormous amphitheatre, you'll be walking over these enormous slabs of names of very, very young children, poor workers, whole families that are just stacked, you know, 10 deep to a plot. And this is just, it's rather overwhelming in terms of thinking about your place in a cemetery environment. I mean, it's a beautiful place. It's a lot of fun. There's a lot of collectible postcards about Rock Cemetery, and you can have a laugh thinking about Robin Hood, looking at the angels. But when you come into the very centre of it, it makes you feel very, very small. I think it's a very beautiful moment to have, and it's a very rare moment to have, especially in such a concealed and beautiful place. So I really would recommend anyone visit Rock Cemetery and wear sensible shoes as well, and only go by tour. But it is a really beautiful place, and it's very important to anyone in Nottingham to visit.
You say only go by tour. What do you mean by that? In
that previously you were able to walk down these slopes into the catacombs, but because of a lot of, let's say, nocturnal partying, the council have had to put up enormous metal gates. So theoretically you could get in, but it's about a 20-foot drop. So unless you're particularly good at parkour.
I understand what you mean there. Well, you've certainly sold Nottingham Rock Cemetery a lot better than you did your previous one. So I think that's definitely going on the list there, because Nottingham's a great place to go for any kind of spooky visit, because as you say, it's got lots of pubs, lots of haunted places. You know, there's all those underground caves and stuff like that. So it's an amazing place to go. And you've got Robin Hood, so that's pretty cool as well. Now, the next one we're talking about is Warstone Lane in Birmingham. Tell us about that one.
Warstone Lane is another concealed cemetery, and it's also another cemetery with kind of catacombs. Warstone Lane was founded in 1842, and is one of, I think it's one of Birmingham's first Victorian cemeteries. The last interment was in 1982, so considering that there are no new burials, the place has fallen into quite a lot of disrepair, but in doing so, a lot of really interesting natural features have come about, and you'll see throughout Warstone Lane a lot of beautiful family vaults that have been split in two by trees. You'll see enormous dips of graves where lots of leaves have gathered and birds have made nests, and it's a really rich place for wildlife, but again a lot of social history. But Warstone Lane is just off the Jewellery Quarter. Their catacombs are very, very interesting because, I say they're catacombs, they were made to make the most of the existing sand pit again. So once again, it's from a mining perspective, but that sand pit was created for metal manufacturing. So instead of, we think of glass industry, Birmingham had a lot more steel and metal work going on. And in order to incorporate this into the wider cemetery, a lot of rather deep, like big family vaults were fitted, which are really, they are huge structures, and they've all been concreted up now. And this might not sound very, very interesting, but these catacombs were produced an entire cemetery act because the smell from these burials was so intense that the Birmingham Council put together an act to make sure that all burials that weren't below ground had to be sealed with pitch, because people were getting incredibly violently ill when they were visiting, which is just delightful. But the catacombs themselves are a delight to visit because they are a health and safety nightmare. And I think it's a lot of fun to visit somewhere where you might break your ankle. So on the upper layer, these are it's like two double-decker buses. On the upper layer, there's absolutely nothing to stop you falling off, and about 15 foot. So you can go up, you can appreciate it, be careful of the falling wall, be careful of all the falling burials, and try not to fall to your death. So it's an interesting place in that it's the epitome of the Victorian overgrown spooky cemetery, got to watch your step, but it's rich with Birmingham history. There is Titanic survivors there. There's some really unusual, beautiful headstones, like a family tree, a literal family tree, and there's a particularly interesting burial there called John Baskerville. I'll just say a little bit about John. He was an 18th century, I think he was a lord. He was a very, very wealthy man, but he was an atheist. And his wish upon death was to be buried upright, in an airtight coffin and in consecrated ground. But when he died, nowhere would take him because he was such an outspoken atheist in life. He was buried in the grounds of his house, but then when that was sold several decades later, they had this little mausoleum on site, and so the people who were redigging the house needed to put this body somewhere. So Banville was a bit of a pain in the bum. So he ended up being buried in a local church underneath just to get rid of him. And then the church was demolished and everyone could get moved apart from Banville. And the person, I think it might have been before that, when one of the workers found his body, they couldn't pass it on to anyone. And so the worker just thought, I'll have it. I'll have Banville. And so this, I think I've written down, his name's Thomas Gibson, had the corpse of John Banville for several years. And because he was buried in an airtight coffin, Gibson looked inside and saw this 100-year-old body was perfectly preserved. And so Gibson made a bit of extra pocket money for himself and a lot of notoriety by charging the Birmingham public sixpence to peek in at Banville. And he did that for several years, for a long time, until the repeated exposure to air caused Banville to not look so beautifully preserved. And then again, it was a case of where the heck are we going to put Banville? And after many years of being paraded round and being drawn by medical professionals as a bit of a study, he ended up at Warstone Lane in a bit of a mass grave. So he did sort of end up in consecrated ground after all, but he took the longest trip about the houses to get there. And I think in so many cemeteries, there'll be some really bizarre stories like that. And I think the Birmingham one is fantastic.
You've definitely sold that one. That's another one going on the list. I think we all need to give there. I'm a bit scared. I mean, you weren't really selling it very well when you're saying I could break an ankle or something like that. So, but
without a bit of excitement,
it is, give you a thrill, a thrill and a chill. So the next one is Sheffield General Cemetery. Tell us about that.
Sheffield General was the first large privately owned cemetery outside of London. So in a lot of ways, it mimics the Magnificent Seven, some of the larger Victorian cemeteries. And again, it's huge, it's sprawling, it's beautiful, and it's a proper garden cemetery. Again, it's rather overgrown, but you can approach it as like a beautiful day out. There's winding alleyways, there's lots of different different features that you can go and appreciate just as an outdoor space. Now this was mainly useful in Sheffield because of a particularly large cholera outbreak in 1832, and it was built as a response to, like many others, Sheffield's cemeteries becoming so overburied,
Yeah.
that
Overfilled.
Overfilled with the dead, that the smells were becoming quite offensive.
Oversubscribed. I think that's probably a better one. So.
But inside, it's got some really beautiful listed monuments and buildings, and a really lovely chapel that's been restored recently. I think last time I went, actually the first time I went, I thought this place is going to be, on the floor in a pile of rubble. But it's one of those cemeteries where a lot of locals have banded together to make the cemetery half as grand as it once was. And the central building, which did function as a chapel, is really cute. It's a little dinky church, but with such an enormous spire that was built specifically so it could be seen from far away. It looks rather jarring, and it doesn't look particularly right. And Sheffield has also got catacombs, in a sense, but unlike the others, Sheffield's catacombs weren't popular at all. And within 10 years, there was just 10 burials. So I think it's quite interesting when you see the differences between burial preferences between counties. In London, the catacombs were filling up really quickly as it was seen quite exclusive, whereas the further north you get, they didn't have quite the same appeal. And throughout Sheffield as well, there are some beautiful buildings that are now being used for events and so forth. But one of my particular favourite things that I think you can do more at Sheffield General than you can in many others is look at different jobs that are mentioned. And I think that's something you can do with the whole family. It's another way of interacting with a cemetery space. But going round a lot of the older graves, so many more have professions listed, things like ivory merchant, and very outdated things like that. So I think Sheffield offers a lot more, like so many different varieties of interest for the whole family. There are beautiful structures, there are buildings, they do events there, and as far as wildflowers go, it's fantastic. But it has some wonderfully odd headstones, and I think there's definitely something to be said for oddness. No, I don't.
That's another one that, I mean, these are all fantastic places. They're very, very. I was just thinking, you've brought us from Lincolnshire to Nottingham, Birmingham to Sheffield, and now we're off to Bristol with Arnos Vale, which you've mentioned before in your previous video. It's a cemetery that I believe you do some volunteer work for.
Yes, yeah. Arnos Vale's kind of I call it my cemetery. It's certainly not. I don't have shares. But Arnos is, I think it's the model towards which all other cemeteries should work in a way. I think that they balance public events, local interaction, and heritage and wildlife all really well. I think if you want to preserve these kinds of spaces, you need to involve the public. But it comes back to the Cleethorpes thing as well. If you start with a really good relationship with a burial space, you'll treasure that because it becomes such an important hub in a way. And with Arnos Vale, it's in the centre of Bristol. Well, it's just by Brislington, and it's a beautiful Victorian cemetery. It was built in 1837. I think the first burial was 39. I think I might get that wrong and get berated. And it's a beautifully designed cemetery. It has two separate chapels. It was the Anglican and the Dissenters. It's the model of Victorian, not celebration of death, because I don't like that term, but it's the model of a Victorian healthy life about death. It's a space that's meant to be interacted with. The buildings are beautiful, the walkways are beautiful, there's always families there, and you can always find something new. There are amazing, enormous monuments to basically the people that built Bristol. So there's shipbuilders, there's merchants, there's murderers, there's everything, and it's all beautifully preserved, but without hacking back what makes a modern cemetery important. So Arnos have got a whole wild area now that they use for green burials, which is a very popular, burial alternative today. And they really push the importance of keeping a wildlife sanctuary in the centre of a city. So it's got an enormous bat population. Some of the rarest bats in the UK are there. They're under the big lodges. They've got horseshoe bats. And so to not only bring people into the cemetery and appreciate the cemetery, they can add things on top of that to appreciate bats. So children won't grow up being afraid of cemeteries and afraid of bats. They'll start thinking, let's go for, a drink in the cemetery because they've got a cafe. Let's go to see a lecture at the cemetery because Kate's on. I've heard she's brilliant. And go on a bat walk. So I think while Arnos has all these qualities as a beautiful historical site, it goes so far beyond that. And so many smaller cemetery sites don't really appreciate that cemeteries, they are solemn and they're very important places, but they're meant to be filled with life as well. And doing so isn't disrespectful. It's a real necessity to keep these places alive and to celebrate them.
Well, thank you for that. I thank you for sharing your experiences in these cemeteries. I think you've sold them all very well. Even the first one, the one that was your own first cemetery, your first love cemetery. I'm definitely going to have to visit them all because I mean, you talked about the Magnificent Seven here in London. They're pristine, they're magnificent, as they say, but also they're very clean and they're very well maintained. And I believe Highgate up until the 70s and 80s was a bit unkempt, but you don't get that anymore. But you've got to love a cemetery that's a bit wild and woolly. So some of these places do seem like they'd be an adventure to visit. And
not everything has to be trimmed and perfectly clean to appreciate it. It's have an adventure, put some decent walking boots on, get in the fresh air and appreciate what's around you. Just because it isn't mowed to within an inch of its life or death, it doesn't mean that it's not a fantastic and interesting place.
Yeah, and I think we're the spooky owls here. We're not in for the the clean and the what do you call it, the very nice and cut. We want something a little bit spooky with bats and overgrown and things that are maybe not as kept as other. So thank you for that, Kate. As always, it's been highly educational. I'm excited about going to them. So hopefully I'll be able to visit one or two of them sooner rather than later. They're very far away from each other though. You've not given us ones that we could get to in one trip. So,
but if you go up to Cleethorpes, you've got to make sure you have some fish and chips while you're there for the full experience.
Well, we will. There you go. There's something else for the list then. So. You've done something for your hometown there anyway, so it's yeah. So anyway, thank you, Kate. We'll talk to you next time.
Right, thanks very much.